So thank you everyone for attendance of this seminar. I would like to start from acknowledgement of the country. I wish to acknowledge the people of the Kulin nations on whose land Monash University is positioned. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. So this is a part of Monash Biomedical Imaging Seminar Series. And this is also co-hosted by Monash Neuroscience of Consciousness Lab, of which I am the head. My name is Nao Tsuchiya. And also it is co-hosted by the Melbourne Monash Consciousness Research Network, MMCR. Before starting, just a couple of housekeeping notes. Please ask your questions for the speaker via Q&A function from the Zoom functions, or if you can't find it and have difficulty in using Q&A, you can also post your comment or question to Zoom webinar chat. You should be able to do that. And as a host, I or Jenny Wind or Thomas Andrion will pick up these questions, and then we'll ask clarification to Karina during the talk, if it's short and crisp question. And we will have also time for Q&A towards the end of the section. Before we plan to finish this seminar by 11 a.m. in Australian time. So, okay, otherwise, I would like to introduce the speaker, Professor Kalina Christoff. So she's very well known for her work and the contribution on the mind wandering, and which is the topic that she's going to talk today mainly. She's a professor in the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, and primarily interested in human thought. And she uses functional neuroimaging, behavior testing, and a theoretical framework to study the aspects of spontaneous and goal-directed and creative kind of thoughts. And she's also interested in various functions of consciousness, such as introspection, metacognition, boredom, meditation, dreams, and different forms of self-experience. So I'm quite excited to hear what she's going to talk about today. And please go ahead, Karina.
Thank you so much. And thank you for this invitation and for this very kind introduction. I look forward to hearing any questions throughout I'm happy to address questions during the talk, but I also really look forward to our discussions afterwards. So I'll launch right into it. What I wanted to start with is share with everyone how I got interested in mind wandering and really the brain. And that happened fairly early on in my adolescence. I grew up in Eastern Europe and used to spend a significant chunk of my days on a bus that looked something like this. And I remember buses were usually full of people that at the time had no devices in their hands. And for the most part, people didn't tend to read books either because the buses were very bumpy up and down. So I remember looking at people's faces and trying to figure out what they were thinking about, because everyone looked like they were lost in thought in some way. And the paradox that I always presented itself to myself was that these people looked very motionless to me, and their faces were usually very still. But my mind in my own head was moving all over the place. And I always wondered, are their minds like mine, moving all over the place, or are they as still as their bodies? And so that stayed with me. And it made me interested throughout my undergraduate and graduate career in just studying how people think, how they think, not just when you give them an experimental task or a problem, but also how they think when they're just sitting on the bus with nothing to do. Flash forward something like 30 years later, unfortunately, we have very few opportunities to sit on the bus with nothing to do, because we tend to be armed with all kinds of devices, oftentimes multiple devices at a time, and we're left with very little time to do. And one big question, of course, that's always on my mind is, how much of these devices and electronics that keep us busy with our to-do lists and all kinds of things to do helped us become healthier or mentally better adjusted? Have they helped us, or have they actually made us in some ways less mentally healthy and less mentally happy in some way. So it's been a question on my mind and something that's motivated my interest in clinical research, which I'll mention a little bit into. But in that period of time between me as a teenager sitting on the bus in Eastern Europe and now sitting in transport with a lot more things to do, something happened in neuroscience that was quite revolutionary. That was the detection or the invention or the discovery of what became known as the default network of the brain. And the default network of the brain, which of course you've heard about, became known as this set of regions that tended to become activated when people did nothing. A bit like the people in the bus I used to see as a teenager who were just sitting there doing nothing. In these cases, the default network became identified from people lying in the scanner doing nothing. And neuroscientists used to think that doing nothing meant not much going on in the brain, or at least nothing consistently going on in the brain. And so we were all very surprised as neuroscientists in the early 2000s when Mark Rako came along with a massive meta-analysis showing that actually it wasn't nothing, it was something, and that something was not randomly distributed throughout the brain. It was actually focused on specific parts of the brain that were highly metabolically active when people, quote unquote, did nothing. So right around the time I was in graduate school, and my in addition to some of the later studies that came up that showed that this default network is not just important for doing nothing in the scanner, but it actually ended up being hugely important for the development of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. It turns out that that's where it starts. Going back to the time when we first were discovering this doing nothing part of our brain, my vantage point on it was slightly different because I wasn't doing PET as Mark Rako was doing. I was doing fMRI, and I wasn't doing a comparison between really difficult tasks versus nothing, rest in the scanner. Instead, I was actually looking at some very well-matched tasks just to see what is somehow special to rest. And one of the interesting things I saw at the time was that when you compare a really easy task to rest, an easy task in this case being press a right button for a right arrow on the screen versus a left button for a left arrow, just something that just keeps you attending, but not a lot of engagement. What happened was that a bunch of other regions outside of the default network were activated for that kind of rest. And so that got me clued on to something going on during rest that isn't rest, because these regions that were activated, first of all, had a lot to do with the mediotemporal lobe part of the default network, but also a lot of them had to, were positioned in the lateral part of the prefrontal cortex, which I'd seen be highly activated during problem solving. So something in these data eventually panned out in some later meta-analysis that we ended up doing that looked at various different states that we end up calling, relating with the word mind wandering, although I'll bring up some of the problems with the use mind wandering to describe things that are happening in the scanner under different circumstances. But this is a later meta-analysis that we more recently did with Kieran Fox, one of my former graduate students, as the lead author here. And what we did see is that in addition to the default network, the executive network of the brain is very highly and systematically activated when people do things in the scanner that can be considered as involving mind wandering. So things like a rest or things like an easy task that does not involve a lot of thinking. So I'll come back a little bit to these data, but in the meantime, I want to bring up these considerations as to what we call this thing that's happening in the scanner or on the bus when we seem to be not doing anything. Again, people look motionless. They don't seem to be moving much. Sometimes they stare at one point. But what is actually going on in their mind? So this is something that we spent the last several decades, not just myself and my group, but a number of groups, including Jonathan Schooler, who's part of the audience today, just trying to figure out this mystery of the mind that appears still on the outside, but may be very far from still, in fact, very active on the inside, especially judging by the brains of these people. So one thing that you will notice is if you read literature on things related to resting state or mind wandering is that there's all these terms that people have used, and the literature goes much further back than just the last 2 decades. The last 2 decades mark the use of neuroimaging for the understanding of these kinds of resting state type of mental processes. But going back to the 1960s, there's a lot of almost underground discussions that were happening underground at the beginning, because they had to somehow coexist with, to begin with, behaviorism a little bit, and then the cognitive revolution. But people had to call something these kinds of thought processes that occurred when people did nothing overtly. So the kinds of words that you oftentimes come across it's a long list. So those words include contemplation. Daydreaming has been a word that going back to people like Jerome Singer and John Teasdale, they've been using these words and have been writing about them. Task-unrelated thought has been a common term that's been used. Stimulus-independent thought, perceptually decoupled thought is one that has been introduced as well. I've tried to introduce the term spontaneous thought, and I'll tell you why I think it's an interesting one to consider. Others, including ourselves, have also tried the word self-generated thought. And of course, one of the most popular terms that is stuck around and was introduced by Jonathan Schooler, Jonathan Smallwood, some 12 years ago, or rather 14 years ago now, is mind-wandering. And that's the word that's stuck a lot. But one of the things that happens is that we actually don't have very good definitions of all these words or of all these terms. And there's a lot of overlap between them. So there's somewhat of a remaining work for us to do to clarify, are these all different from each other? Are they the same? And ultimately, the really interesting question here is, what happens during these states? And there's some superordinate state here that subsumes all of these, which is that state that you see in this picture, where people are thoughtful, they're contemplating something, and we can ask them to see what's going on in their mind, or we can scan their brain, or we can do both, which is what we've tried. And this is what we've been trying to use in order to get beyond that appearance of nothingness, which is very deceptive. So some of the things that we have found out ourselves and other groups work again from the last really half a century is that something like 30 to 50% of the thoughts that people report during these kinds of states that appear motionless, but are actually active on the inside, are thoughts that are not about the here and now. And that's been interesting because that coincides with some of these terminology about stimulus-unrelated thought and perceptually decoupled thought. Something else that we've learned is that thoughts arise with incredibly high frequency. So some assumptions that people make is that if you just sit still and do nothing, thoughts would grind down to a halt and you would get a mental rest, and nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, even in people with really long meditation training, with scanned meditators that have been meditating for decades, for 20, 30 years with multiple retreats and so forth, people that have been trying to quiet their minds through retreats and practice for half of their lives, even in their minds, thoughts appear to arise on the average every 10 seconds. And those are spontaneously arising thoughts. So that's really frequent. And the mind seems to be never addressed, including when we sleep. We have all kinds of thought mentation in the form of dreams during sleep. The other thing that we've discovered is that, this is work by Jess Andrews Hanna, mental time travel is really common. And what that means is that we tend to think again about things from the past or things that might happen in the future. And we kind of tend to move around time freely. And that's fairly common. Some thoughts have a non-temporal dimension to them, but actually a majority of them have some kind of a marker as to what time they're occurring or they're simulated in. One thing interesting that you might have heard about is about the affect associated with these kinds of wandering minds, thoughts and spontaneous thoughts and so forth. And one misconception in literature is that the wandering mind is an unhappy mind. And this misconception came from a title of a paper that we have looked into in depth and looked into how the claims of that paper replicated. And even though the title of this paper claimed that a wandering mind is an unhappy mind, and this is the kind of title that you were likely to find if we read high profile journals such as Science, what actually pans out is that it's not really an unhappy mind, but it's something much less fancy sounding. Really, when the mind wanders, it tends to be, on the average, mildly positive to neutral. So within that, sometimes people say, well, it's the glass half full, half empty type of phenomena. If you look at the neutral, sometimes people think, well, that's not happy enough, and therefore I'll hold that as unhappy. But if you have a half glass full type of approach, you might think of it as a positive. In either way, what we really see, the real story is not whether the wandering mind is happy or unhappy. The real story, this is actually something else that we've done. If you look at the averages, they tend to be at the midpoint of any scale from happy to unhappy. But the real story is the incredible variability in people's internal thoughts during these kinds of rest-like or motor inactive states. So some people, and this is from data that was published by Tim Wilson in Science, which was very kindly provided and made accessible to anyone who wanted to reanalyze it, which we did. What we saw in that data set is that people just vary a lot in how much they enjoy their mind wandering. Some people hate it, some people love it. Most people are kind of like, yeah, it's okay. It's not as good as being engaged in something, but it's not as good as ruminating either. So there's a huge variability in how much people enjoy, how much people are entertained by their own thoughts that are mostly spontaneous, and how much sometimes people are bored with these thoughts. So some people are bored extremely, and some people are not at all bored. They find it very interesting. So I say, whenever you see a claim about mind wandering being this or that, when it comes to affect, take it with a grain of salt, because there's such incredible individual variability that I think it's actually really hard to make generalizable statements about what it is. It's different for different people. When it comes to understanding clinical conditions and clinical disorders and clinical alterations in thought, the thought's contents, including their affective quality, of course, make a big difference. So someone who is very unhappy with their internal thoughts is likely to suffer from mood disorder and so forth. So the thought content, including their emotional tone, are an important feature when it comes to understanding clinical disorder. But it's not the only feature, and that will be my big claim today. Because even more important than the content, and this is something that we've argued explicitly, is understanding thoughts dynamics. Not just what the contents are, but how they actually change over time. This is what I'm referring here as the dynamics. So in case you end up mind wandering during the rest of the talk, or wandering off, as I would say, I wanted to give you a preview of the conclusions of the talk. And those are that if the claim that I'd like to make is that if we take a dynamic approach to understanding human thought and brain networks, this actually allows us to better understand the nature of different types of thoughts and come up with a better taxonomy of thought, as well as the interrelationships between different kinds of thoughts. And I'll tell you what I mean by different kinds of thought as we go along. But perhaps even most importantly, if the dynamics of thought that are going to be one of the keys to understanding the role of thought in clinical disorders. And we know that there are alterations to thinking in pretty much all clinical disorders that are in some case diagnostic and markers of what's going on with that clinical disorder. So what I'll start with is a little bit of a discussion of what mind wandering is and how we have come to understand it and how we've come to some extent, disagree about what it is. So of course, the question of what is mind wandering can have a number of answers. And if you take an approach that emphasizes the content versus the dynamics, you end up having a different answer to that question. So what is mind wandering? If you take a content-based approach, and this is what a lot of literature and studies has taken, including some of my own work, the predominant answer that's being given by the literature so far is that mind wandering is task-unrelated and or perceptually decoupled thought. So going back to this notion that I told you, task that's not about the here and now in some way. So this is one answer. And that answer you give, which is a dominant view in the scientific literature, and it wasn't until recently, is that is based on analyzing the static content of a particular mental state. And it's not necessarily interested in how thoughts change over time. Now, you can ask the same question, what is mind wandering, and take a dynamic approach. And so my argument is that if we actually focus on the dynamics instead of the static contents, we actually give a very different answer. And that answer that we provided in a framework that I'll discuss is that mind wandering is actually thought that is less constrained than the typical kind of thought or the problem solving type of thought that we might have. And it's more freely moving. So if you pay attention to the dynamics, then you have to analyze what kind of emotion or what kind of a change from one mental state to another characterizes a wandering mind. So this claim we made in a paper that we published several years ago in Nature Neuroscience with a number of my collaborators. Some of them have been my trainees, but a lot of them my collaborators. So Zach Irving, Kieran Fox, Nathan Sprang, and Jess Andrews Hanna. And what we put together is a dynamic framework of thought that's grounded in the neuroscience of dynamic frameworks, which I'll tell you a little bit about. And the point that we made in there is that mind wandering should be understood as a form of spontaneous thought. And if it is understood that way, then it opens the door for linking it to all kinds of other ways of understanding thought and all kinds of other types of thought, including creative thought, including nighttime dreaming, but also rumination and so forth. So really quickly, the static content-based definitions of mind wandering, what they do is that for the most part, they fail to capture one of its most defining qualities. And so ironically, that defining quality is actually captured in the word wander if you just look up its dictionary definition, because the word wander, before you append mind in front of it, really signifies a manner of movement. And that manner is a very specific one. To wander means to move hither and thither, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, without fixed course or certain aim. And there's different definitions, but notice that wander always is about motion, and it's about a manner of motion, right? It's not about where you end up, it's about how you move around space. Wander, of course, is a metaphor for how you move around space, and then mind wander becomes a higher order metaphor for how you move around your mental space. Now, mind wandering and spontaneous thought, if we take that dynamic approach, what we did was we defined spontaneous thought as thought that arises relatively freely. So it has to do with the arising of a thought and then with the change from one thought to the next. And then, of course, you have to deal with why does it arise relatively freely? And so freedom in general is meaningless unless it's defined in terms of what creates freedom or what are the conditions that facilitate freedom. And in this case, what we end up putting a lot of thought into is how the absence or the relative absence of constraints on thought create the conditions for thoughts to arise and move relatively freely. So because there aren't any strong constraints on the contents of thought and on the transitions from one mental state to another, we experience and we go through these mental states that move relatively freely. So that's an analysis of what freely moving thought might be. And it probably sounds very abstract. So I'm going to ground it a bit into types of constraints that we've identified that when relaxed, allow the mind to move freely, relatively. So we identified two broad categories of constraints that when applied to the mind, make it less freely moving and less wandering around. So one type of constraints is relatively easy to address. We call these deliberate constraints. That is basically what psychologists and neuroscientists oftentimes refer to as cognitive control and executive functions, and what people refer from outside of science as force of will. By the sheer force of your will, you could decide to constrain your mind so it doesn't wander away from the task at hand. If you're listening to something and you go, oh, I was thinking about something else, now I'm going to constrain it to bring it back to the lecture. So in the act of doing that, you're using your cognitive control and executive functions, and you're deliberately constraining your thoughts, and you're not engaging in the act of mind wandering because you are deliberately constraining your thoughts. You're not engaging in a mind wandering in that dynamically defined way. Now, in terms of the neuroscience behind it, we actually have a very good understanding of what the neural basis of these cognitive control and executive functions are. They've been linked to the cognitive control networks of the brain. FPCN here stands for the frontoparietal control network, which I'll show you a brief picture of. But there's at least one other networks which sometimes is mentioned, the singular opercular control network, which somewhat overlaps, but sometimes it's isolated as having a specific kind of control functions. I won't be getting into that, but we discussed that in our paper at length. Now, the other big, broad type of constraint that we identified is a lot more nebulous, but actually a lot more potentially relevant to clinical conditions, as I'll mention. We called these automatic constraints on thought. So sometimes thought becomes constrained, not because you're trying to constrain it, but because it just happens to be habitually constrained, or there's some emotional constraint on it. So what we identify as sources of these automatic constraint of thoughts are affective salience. So the affective salience could be a thought arises and it just happens to grab your attention because it's effectively salient. So you might have just thought of a parking ticket that you forgot to pay. Well, it's effectively salient because nobody likes to pay fines for their forgotten to be paid parking tickets. It could have a motivational intensity. A thought could have just a reason that happens to be very much near and dear to your heart's concerns about your life right now. So that thought is likely to grab your attention automatically because it relates to your motivations and emotions, but you don't deliberately make yourself attend to it. Your mind just attends to it almost unintentionally. So we call these automatic constraints on thought. Of course, habits, including mental habits, but also physical habits that make you think certain things, are part of the automatic constraints that we actually don't understand very well. So one of the things that you notice is that these automatic constraints, first of all, we do not have a very good understanding of how they're implemented by the brain, but we have a very good guess that they're not very as localized as the frontoparietal control network, because a lot of the brain does affect, a lot of the brain is involved in motivation, and habits are also represented in different kinds of structures. So one thing that could be said is that, we're still trying to identify the sources of automatic constraints, and we have some initial hunches and hypotheses that we're testing currently as to what they might be related to, which I'll tell you about. So these automatic constraints are the ones that, as I'll argue, end up being very important for clinical conditions. And one of the interesting things that happens if you distinguish between automatic and deliberate constraints is that you can now distinguish between different types of thoughts that you couldn't if you didn't have these two types of constraints in mind. So here's what I mean by that. What I'm representing here is a conceptual space which we use to relate different types of thoughts to each other, which we find helpful in terms of generating hypotheses and understanding a number of things, including clinical disorders. When both deliberate constraints and automatic constraints are relatively weak, that is, there's an absence of strong deliberate or automatic constraints, we refer to that as that part of the conceptual space can contain spontaneous thoughts. So in this case, thought occurs relatively spontaneously, and mind wandering is part of that spontaneous thought. But there's two other interesting cases here. One is dreaming. Dreaming is in some ways even less constrained than mind wandering. And everyone's had experiences of nighttime dreaming when things move even more wildly than during mind wandering. But what we also include here under spontaneous thought is creative thinking. Creative thinking is a really interesting phenomenon, and in some ways it defies being put into a box like that because it's such a dynamic process. And we've written about that and argued because creative thinking really is a vacillation between really extremely freely flowing thinking and actually a very critical evaluative process. And so the most creative people are very good at going back and forth between being completely unconstrained and very critical, and then going back to completely being unconstrained and back and forth. So when we put it here, that's actually kind of an averaging of that process, which doesn't do justice to the creative thinking process. But as you see, it's helpful in terms of generating some interesting prediction as to how the brain handles these different automatic constraints. Now, the interesting thing that also you could do here, because of the dissociation between automatic and deliberate constraints that this space suggests, is that now we can distinguish between goal-directed thought, which is high on deliberate constraints, but it could be anything on automatic constraints. It could be high or low on automatic constraints. The way it's defined is it's being high on deliberate constraints. And you can distinguish between something else that oftentimes is undistinguishable between goal-directed thought, which is rumination or obsessive thought. And those are, of course, markers of clinical conditions. Although rumination and obsession doesn't have to be negative in the clinical context, it's negative. So people go to their healthcare practitioners and say, I'm bothered by this rumination or obsession, so please help. But you could be ruminating or obsessing about something positive that helps with your work or that actually makes you feel good. And in these cases, it's unlikely to be presented in a clinical context. So the clinical context here, one of the interesting things is that it's actually marked, and this is our claim, by really strong automatic constraints. And we're agnostic as to what is the level of deliberate constraints, but because of the automaticity of thought and the difficulty in getting out of these ruts of rumination and obsession, the prediction as to how it pans out in the brain is different compared to something like a goal-directed thought, which you can disengage in very easily, whereas rumination is by definition really hard to disengage in, because if you could, you just wouldn't ruminate, right? So one of the things that I'll show as we go along is how we map that conceptual space onto the different dynamic brain networks. So what you see here are, and we talk more about this in the paper, what you see here are the different influences between the different dynamic networks. So the frontal parietal control network, which exerts in red arrows here, the deliberate constraints on the dynamics of brain state, interacts with networks such as the dorsal attentional network on the left, the core part of the default network, as well as the salience networks. And so one of the things that I'll argue here is that, if I have time, because I'll probably have to shorten my talk here, is that the red arrows here represent these deliberate influences. So the frontal parietal control network is kind of the tip of the iceberg of our processing, of mental processing, is the conscious tip. And it's consciousness that helps us constrain the dynamics of brain states and the mental dynamics. But there's some constraining that's also being applied from the core part of the default network, and now distinguish it from the medial temporal lobe next, as well as those salience networks that grab our attention in automatic fashion, oftentimes bottom-up fashion. So the blue arrows here represent the automatic constraints that are implemented by different networks of the brain, and also they manifest in terms of automaticity of thought and automaticity of mental processes. Now, one thing that happens is that there's also purple arrows here, and I'll briefly mention these, but with all these constraints, something has to generate some variability. And our argument is that there's at least two sources of variability, although there might be more, but I'm focusing on them. One is the perceptual sources of variability. So places like the sensory motor areas that perceive inputs from the environment, those inputs serve to actually create variability in the brain. And so that variability, they can be constrained so that you can pay attention to one thing rather than the multiple things that are out in the environment. But there's an interesting parallel that we call the conceptual sources of experience that seems to be sourced in the medial temporal lobe of the default network. And that has to do with some very interesting sources of variability that the brain seems to be generating in the absence of external stimulation. So I've recently come to referring to those as conceptual sources of variability or conceptual sources of experience, because there's the sensory sources of experience, but there's also the conceptual sources that are likely what gives rise to these non-stop thoughts that we tend to engage in, even when our body stops to move, and even when we close our eyes in the scanner or at night, for that matter. So really quickly, the salience networks of the brain are very quickly displayed here. I'll actually gloss over them, but two of the really important regions that tend to be identified as part of the salience networks are the anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula. And they're the ones that tend to be involved in the automatic orienting of attention, be that orienting to attention to external stimuli that tend to be assessed as salient, or internal thoughts that tend to be assessed as somehow salient motivationally. And then also really quickly, to give you a sense of where these networks are relatively positioned in the brain, I've already mentioned the frontal parietal control network, but there's also the default network, which the core part of it is represented in dark blue here. And then all the other regions are part of the other sub-networks of the default, which I'll mention more about. And then the dorsal attentional network, which I will not talk about today, which is involved in the more perceptual aspects of experience and constraining them automatically, is positioned in different parts of the brain. So when I say networks here, one thing I should qualify is that those networks are defined functionally. So whenever neuroscientists talk about these networks, they're not necessarily structurally directly connected to each other, these regions. So some of these regions do have direct anatomical connections, but some of them do not. And what defines them is that when we look at the signal of the brain in these regions, they tend to fluctuate up and down in correlation with each other or in unison. And that is how we identify them as networks. So when one of those regions goes up, the other that is similarly colored goes up. But the networks don't necessarily fluctuate together. They can sync with each other or they can become dissociated. And so when I talk about dynamic networks of the brain, and anyone we talk about that, what we're referring is to these dynamic interaction between the different networks that are to begin with functionally defined. So one really interesting distinction that we've proposed and we're testing currently, but it's based on some data that I'll show you, is that when you hear a default network, people try to ascribe a unitary function to the default network oftentimes. But because of these dynamics that we're looking at and because of the distinction between automatic constraints and conceptual variability in thought, we've proposed, and there's some evidence that I'll show you, that there's actually a different function that the core part of the default network performs relative to the medial temporal lobe part of the default network. So what we've done is to link the default network core in dark blue here to automatic constraints on these conceptual sources of thought, while the medial temporal lobe appears to be involved in the spontaneous generation of mental content, not on the constraining of it, but on the generation of novel states. So what is the evidence for this so far? Well, one of the sources of evidence is a study that former graduate student of mine, Melissa Elamil, did with highly experienced meditators. So these are meditators who had about 10,000 hours or more of mindfulness practice, during which they would have observed their thoughts and the arising of their thoughts in detail and precision. And the reason why we did that study with these highly experienced meditators is because if we had a chance of detecting the onset of a thought with precision that we needed to see what happens immediately prior to the onset of a spontaneous thought, that was the best chance we had, was in these effectively highly trained introspective observers. Whereas for people who don't necessarily have practice or proclivity toward observing their own thoughts, thoughts can oftentimes seem like a uninterrupted train of thought. So sometimes people say, well, thoughts don't arise in their mind because there's always something in there. But for the people that have been doing this for many decades, the ability to quiet the mind temporarily actually sets the stage for being able to observe the arising of a next thought. And this is what these meditators did in this case. What we had them do is we had them press a button at the arising of a spontaneous thought. We also had them classify the nature of the thought, but I won't be getting into detail about that. We also had a control condition, which I won't talk about that in this case. But one of the really interesting things we observed, and we were able to observe it in the several seconds prior to the button press. So the button press here indicates that a spontaneous thought has just been detected, right? And so what we were trying to look at is what happens preceding that point. And what happens preceding that point, first of all, I was really surprised by how lengthy the period of time before that button press was that something was happening in the brain. And what you see here are medial temporal lobe structures and the functional signal in these medial temporal lobe structures prior to the button press indicating the arising of a thought. And consistently in both bilateral hippocampus and bilateral parahippocampus, what we see is up to 4 seconds prior to the button press. These are seconds in time here. 0 is button press and minus is seconds prior to the button press. There's an elevated activation in terms of the bolt signal in these regions prior to the button press. So something is going on as far as 4 seconds prior to the button press based on these data sets that then leads to the phenomenological experience of a thought arising. And you might argue, well, it takes a little bit of time to make a decision that I should press the button, and there's some neural firing that needs to happen, and that takes time. But what we do know is the decision making and the neural firing that it takes for the decision making to be executed into a button press happens on the order of hundreds of milliseconds, whereas this is on the order of thousands of seconds. So something is happening that precedes the level of awareness in these regions that then gives rise to spontaneous thoughts. And of course, fMRI, as you know, is highly noisy, and our temporal resolution is not very good. So one very reassuring thing is that you can see similar things happening with single cell recordings from the hippocampus and hippocampal formation regions in a study that looked at the spontaneous generation or free recall of memories. This is a study that was published in 2008 that looked at what happens in the hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex, so places of the hippocampal formation, in the seconds prior to the spontaneous free recall of a memory. In this case, those were videos that were presented. And what was seen in this case, that up to 3 seconds prior to the button presses, indicating the spontaneous arising of a freely recalled memory, there's activation happening, indicating single cell recording. So this is not bulk signal, that's single cell recording. And so both of these studies give us some confidence that something's going on in the medial temporal lobe that precedes the subjective experience of a thought arising long enough that it appears to be generating it. And of course, that dovetails with studies from replay of dream experiences or mentation experiences in animals, mostly studies done in rats, that show a replay of of waking experiencing occurring during sleep that are generated from hippocampal structures as well. So going back to these other kinds of thinking that I was telling you about, so if mind wandering is based on the spontaneous generation of thoughts, and so is dreaming, creative thinking has some components of that as well, because a lot of creative thinking involves the generation of ideas, although it also involves their evaluation. And one of the things that we've done that also shows a dissociation between the default network core and the medial temporal lobe part of the default network is this is a study that also Melissa Elamil did. What we did was we can dissociate between the creative idea generation. So when people generate ideas, they should activate more medial temporal lobe, and that's exactly what we see. But when they evaluate their ideas, we see more activation in the core part of the default network, as well as the frontoparietal control network.
Kalina?
Yep.
Couple of questions about clarification on your free recall experiment. Quick one. In the button press experiment, are these response all obtained by the same hand button press?
So just to, this is regards to the highly experienced meditators?
Yeah.
So this one,
like,
right?
Yeah. So, you know, the effect of the motor action, basically.
Yeah, so these are averages over multiple button presses.
Mm-hmm.
So what we did in here, people went through 6 sessions, and each session had something like 12 different blocks during which they detected their thoughts. And so that's why you have also error bars here, right? Because the error bars are indicating of the variability across the different averages. But each of these is averaged across multiple instances within the same person, and also multiple subjects as well. So in this study, we had, I think it was around 18 subjects, and each of them press button to indicate spontaneous rising thought, something on the order of 70 to 80 times.
Always with the right hand or left hand? I mean, I think the question was more to do with the technical, yeah.
Yeah, it's always with the right hand. We did that on purpose because, and right-handed people as well as left-handed people, it doesn't matter because anyone can use their right hand. They actually had 2 button boxes, and one of them was used to indicate the onset of a thought. The other one was used to indicate the kind of thought, whether it was emotional, whether it was verbal. And we did see some activation differences in terms of the types of thought. But all types of thoughts seem to be originating from the medial temporal lobe, regardless of whether they end up evolving to be verbal or evolving to be visual or somatosensory in some cases.
Yeah, that's good. And then another quick one, the relationship, I mean, it could be long. If you think that it's better answered later, we can do it. What's the relationship with Libet's experiment? And also, how do you distinguish this with memory retrieval?
Yeah, so in this case, we controlled it very well. There was no memory retrieval because the other thing we did, as you see, was that there was a match condition where after they had given us with specific timing particular thoughts that spontaneously came up to them and they reported them, we had a time matched condition during which we presented words on the screen occurring at the same time matched to what they previously reported. And they were also matched to the category, whether they were emotional or a visual word and so forth. Now, the words in this case were taken out of the corpus that were matched and so forth. But in this case, there was very little memory component because they were reporting on spontaneously arising thoughts, and the only memory requirements to remember the instructions. But because these were experienced meditators, we specifically gave them instructions that matched as well as possible their meditation practice. So during meditation practice, you do the same thing. You monitor for the spontaneous arising of a thought and you mentally note the thought. So the only thing was just add a button press to that. So any memory demand should be minimal. And also that memory demand should be matched by the control condition. The control condition did not have these increases in activations 4 seconds prior to the button press that we see in the spontaneous generation. Now, the relationship to the Libet experiment is very interesting, but not very close, because the Libet experiment actually is about decision-making. And the time scale of that is in the order of hundreds of milliseconds. Whereas what we're looking here, remember, is thousands of milliseconds. We're looking at seconds. So something is happening that's not to do with decision-making. It's not to do, this is the very interesting part to me, is that it's happening prior to any awareness arises, because these people have spent decades training their awareness to catch those thoughts. So we're getting as close as possible to the arising of awareness with the button press, but the activations are preceding that awareness with seconds. And so this to me is an indication that what we're imaging here is effectively the subconscious processes that are not accessible to awareness, but can give rise to mental states that can be captured by awareness if they bubble up to the more cortical processes that we then observe. Because I don't have this data here to show you, or maybe I do. I'll skip a few slides here, but I don't have them actually. But what we also see is that if you look at after the button press, we see activation in the cingulate cortex of the brain, and then a second after the button press, we see activation in the cortical regions of the frontoparietal control network. So we see a cascade of activation beginning in the medial temporal lobe and then spreading to the cingulate cortices and the core part of the default network, which then cascades further into the frontoparietal control network, almost indicating like an ontogeny of each individual thought that begins with a process that we do not have conscious access into, rising up to processes that we do have conscious access into, but maybe we don't have meta-awareness about, and then rising up to the frontoparietal control network, which we know subserves processes, including meta-awareness. So that's one possible interpretation of these results. The caveat here being is that our temporal resolution is low with fMRI. And so even though we were able to see these, there might be things going on that we just don't see, because especially with this study, the temporal resolution was actually 2 seconds. We're right now replicating this study with a half a second temporal resolution. Unfortunately, we were closed down by COVID, so we're waiting a vaccine before we can replicate that with a half-second resolution.
Okay, I guess there are some more questions, but I'll let you finish. I guess that's probably better.
Well, yeah, what I'll do is actually I'll skip through a lot of my slides, including some of the clinical applications, and I'll just let it potentially come up as questions in the question and answer session, because I think it's more interesting to let you answer questions. But one of the things that I'll just say is that I'll just give you a preview of some of the more recent things that we've been doing. Is we've been actually trying to partialate the frontoparietal control network, which in all of the images that I've shown you seems like a monolith type of structure that sits on top of the hierarchy. But it turns out that there's actually at least two subcomponents that can differentiate within it. And this is very recent work that my former grad student, Matt Dixon, did. So there appear to be at least two parts of the frontoparietal control network, so that if we review this kind of structure, which appears to be hierarchical here, and when I said thoughts appear to be generated here before we become aware of them, they're not even thoughts necessarily at that stage. I call them mental content generation, right? Which then takes the shape of the thoughts that we can become conscious of, but not maybe meta-aware, which then when it reaches the phase of the frontoparietal control network, we can become meta-aware of the fact that we're having a thought, not just of the content of the thought. But then one thing that's important that we're now looking into is that the frontoparietal control network itself appears to be splittable into these two sources of experience, the conceptual and the sensory. So it can become integrated, but it can also flexibly pay attention to more sensory sources and more conceptual sources, and maybe help build meta-awareness of these sources, which is something that's relevant to meditation as well. And that's some of the more recent work that I've done through one of my former undergrad student, now graduate student with Nathan Sprang and McGill. His name is Manesh Gurn. He brought in his interest to psychedelics to our lab. And it turns out the psychedelics are really interesting in terms of understanding further these phenomena that we're discussing, because they really help us understand self-experience and the modifications of self-experience that are really hard to get at in the ordinary mental states that we can test in the scanner, but we can't necessarily access unless we look at psychedelics modifications. And so one of the things that we've done recently is we've tried to expand the dynamic framework of thought that I showed you in order to incorporate where would psychedelics go in that framework in terms of how unconstrained thought becomes during psychedelics administration. And it turns out that psychedelics are actually pretty close up there with nighttime dreaming, if not even more so, in terms of the lack of constraints that they can bring onto mental activity. And in fact, it's one of the interesting things about psychedelics is that they can be used therapeutically in order to bring about a real lowering of constraints so that new states can be explored out of them. And so this is something that we're currently trying to do. So at this point, I'll wrap up and encourage all of you to, next time you sit at a doctor's office and you're waiting for something or on the bus, to actually put away your device and imagine that you're in a pre-industrial world where we were able to freely let our minds wander without having to look up to-do list on your phone of things that you have to do. And I just want to acknowledge all the people that were involved in some main capacity here in generating a lot of these data. And at this point, I just want to open the floor to discussion so that we can cover some of these topics. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Kalina, that was quite inspiring, and also thought-invoking presentation, and there are lots of questions coming up. Jenny, do you want to pick the question, or maybe I'll just read it out then. So there was one question about concern on the experienced meditators. So they may actually present a biased picture of cognitive dynamics and mind wandering, because there may be some kind of effects that are induced by the training itself. Mm-hmm. Or it could be that, because they did mind meditation so much time that their thinking process could be completely different from other people. Because you also showed that epilepsy patients data, it partially answers that kind of concern, but do you want to address that question?
Yeah, it's a question that comes up with a very high degree of frequency. And it's true that this population of meditators is not the typical undergraduate population. There's of course questions that's been raised about the extent to which undergraduate populations are provide us with data that's generalizable to the everyday kind of person out there. But meditators, we thought about that very carefully, right? And so the reason why we wanted to do this study, and when we're replicating it now, we're actually trying to replicate it in people that have relatively little experience with meditation, because one of the things we've shown is that the gains in introspective ability that comes with meditation happen, it's a very steep curve of gains that happens in the first something like 1,000 hours of meditation. And then you're fine-tuning the introspective ability. That's true when it comes to introspective ability to detect bodily processes. And so we don't actually have a good measure of what is your accuracy of introspective observation of your own thoughts, right? We haven't developed that yet. But Kieran Fox, my former student who was very interested in that, did that study and looked at and found that it took something like 500 to 1,000 hours for people to become introspectively very accurate based on meditation on the body with respect to their the sensitivity of their body. So the idea is that we might be able to replicate the same thing with people that have relatively little introspective experience or meditation experience. So I personally don't think that the fundamental principles based on which thoughts become spontaneously generated change in meditators. And actually the biggest basis for my belief in that is the fact that these people are still having a lot of thoughts, right? I mean, they spend like decades quieting their mind, and yet they're having a new thought arise on the average every 10 seconds. That means sometimes a new thought arises every 4 or 5 seconds, right? So think about that. If after 20 years of practice, there's so many thoughts that still arise, I think that's probably the piece of evidence that gives me the most hope that we don't have as much control over that low-level subconscious working of our mind that actually we're looking at with this study. Now, what meditation experience does do, it alters, and that's the big benefit of it, it alters your emotional associations to your thoughts, right? And it actually, this is another argument that we've made, is that what it does as well is it alters the flexibility of thought that you can have. Because when the emotional associations to spontaneously arising thoughts are very strong, they often trigger chains of thoughts that are repetitive and potentially clinically problematic. But what meditation does, it actually unpacks those chains. So it trains you, when you have a spontaneous thought, not to have a predictable and strong emotional reaction to it of evaluation. Like not to tell yourself, I'm a bad person for thinking about that, which often leads to obsessions. Or because I had a thought about the world being a horrible place, that means that the world is a horrible place. So there's actually, it teaches you to unpack those. And so the alterations to thinking probably occur at a higher level of more like what we're referring to as automatic constraints. So this is one thing actually that's testable and empirically possible to investigate, but it's not something that we've looked into specifically.
Okay. Maybe before closing, I want to ask 2 more questions, if that's okay. One is possibly relatively short. The possibility of the mind wandering in non-human primates. Do you know about that, or whether what does it imply? And another one is possibly related to what you have already said right now, which is the role of the metacognition in the externally and internally directed or arising spontaneous thought.
Yeah, those are both excellent questions. So the way I understand mind wandering, which is in terms of this variability in mental content, absolutely. Of course, primates do it. Of course, I think your question was about specifically primate brains. I think rodents do it too, right? Because we see this replay of experiences, but when they start looking at, so this is some brilliant work that's been going on for decades now. Rats are set to explore a maze, and then they go off and stop exploring, and they're consuming their reward for exploring the maze. If you keep recording from the hippocampus not just replays the experience of exploring the maze during that resting period in the rat's hippocampus, it actually starts recombining the experiences. Sometimes it replays it backwards. Sometimes it replays it in little chunks, but no other chunks. And one of the arguments that we've made based on these actually findings and based on a lot of what we understand about how the hippocampus works from rodents, and I believe the hippocampus is actually not that different in terms of some of these low-level processes that it performs for us between rodents, primates, and humans, is that it actually could explain why the mind moves. Because this is actually the part that I skipped in my talk, but we've argued in a handbook that we put together, again, Kieran Fox, one of my former grad students, and I, which is that possibly why the mind moves and why we create that variability is that to help us form better episodic memories and better semantic memories. Because we know from research on learning is that the best learning occurs when it's interleaved. If you study the same thing again and again and again without taking a break, you actually don't form as good of a memory of it than if you study it in interleaved fashion and you interleave it with other things. You tend to form a much more stable memory of it. And what's more, it's better generalizable. So the claim that we've made is that the reason why we evolved, there's an evolutionary benefit to this variability that our minds generate. There's a reason why we keep coming up with things, and sometimes they're very different from what we came up with at a previous moment, is because that actually creates an interleaved nature of replay in our own experiences that helps us form better, more solid episodic memories, and then helps us generalize them into semantically stable memories as we go along. So I think that variability there's absolutely enough evidence to indicate that it exists in primates as well as rodents. The big question is, to what extent do they engage in conscious awareness of this variability, which humans do? And of course, there's arguments around that, and there's indications that something like meta-awareness may not be, commonly found in some of the species around rodents, although they certainly have the ability to reflect, to have a recurrent processing. But something like reflexivity and meta-awareness seems to be particular to only some species, not just humans, but a few other species that have been, looked at in terms of self-recognition and so forth. So when I talk about mind wandering, I oftentimes refer to variability in thought, and there's several layers at which that occurs. And that actually relates to your second question about meta-awareness and how it relates to the internal and external, or what I call now conceptual and sensory streams of consciousness. I think of it as two orthogonal dimensions, right? So on the one hand, we have variability, and variability is very important. I mean, any system sometimes people refer to variability as noise. If you don't have noise in a system, noise is actually, this is true for physiological systems as well. Something like the heart, variability in heartbeat is an indication of healthy heartbeat, right? Same thing for a lot of these other physiological systems. And it's true for the brain as well, is that people like Randy McIntosh are specifically looking at variability as a marker of healthy state and how it's reduced in aging and dementia and so forth. So I think it's the same thing, is there's this variability that actually creates this, what we experience as a wandering mind that keeps generating content, and this content is not always, doesn't get stuck, right? Unless we start ruminating. In a healthy mind, there's variability. I think that's a function of the brain that helps with health, with functioning, and with mental functioning and so forth. But then there's a layer to that we add through different layers of processing. And one of it is actually a subconscious processing that we don't have access to, and we don't have much ability to modify, right? And then there's a second layer which we have conscious access to, but it actually has a lot of automaticity to it, because things enter it and we become aware of it of what we thought about, but we didn't necessarily see how it went from the subconscious to the conscious axis. And then we have another layer which connects the conscious to the meta awareness. And Jonathan Scholar has done work around that conceptually as well. And I think, you know, he's postulated these different layers as well. And so we actually, when we experience our mental states and our thoughts, we really experience the conscious and the meta-conscious two layers, but we don't experience that underconscious or subconscious layer. And something like traumatic experiences that result in something like PTSD actually teach us about how difficult it is to intervene at the level of what the hippocampus does to generate conscious states. Because in trauma, you get these flashbacks that become stereotypical. And there's an indication that there's a breakdown of the transfer, there's a breakdown of the variability, right? And a breakdown of the transference of an episodic memory into a semantic memory. And so when the memory is replayed again and again in the exact same way veridically, without any interleaving or without any modification, then you end up having traumatic flashbacks. The same thing you get, by the way, with hippocampal damage. People actually don't have dreams that are bizarre and novel. They have stereotypical dreams of their waking experiences that just reoccur again and again and again. So there's a lot of converging evidence that what's happening between the medial temporal lobe and the default network part of the default network in terms of this conceptual stream of thought has to do with basically the transference of subconscious processes that we're not aware of into bubbling up into our conscious layers.
Okay, so we can take one question possibly, but we can also end here. Which one should we do? Do you want to take question, Gary?
Yeah, I was just going to say we should just press on now. There's a few other questions that have come up.
Okay.
Get Kalina's views on those.
Yeah, all right.
I think 11:15. For those who can continue on, it's a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, I think there are two also big interesting questions that are coming. One is the mind wandering in children in the same kind of spirit as, you know, mind wandering in animals. So that would be, I think, an interesting big question to ask to you. And another one is, again, the part that you kind of, you know, skipped, which is the mind wandering in the mental disease, such as autism or, you know, attention deficit and so on. Because now you talked about metacognition and also the role of the learning and so on. I think you can also give us some more speculation on this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe I'll even show you my slide on ADHD. Although I think the question was about autism, right? Specifically.
Yes, but I think, you know, if you have story on ADHD,
we have a story around ADHD. Yeah. Well, first of all, mind wandering in children is a really interesting question because there isn't that much research, and the typical approach to cognition in children is to say, well, it's still maturing and it's still there and so forth. But, you know, I have two little kids, you know, they're almost 7 and almost 10 now. And I've watched them go through this phase sometime around 4 and 5, where their imagination just goes wild, right? So it's not a linear process in terms of, and also dreams. I mean, you know, when they were 2 and 3, and I don't know to what extent, I think Jenny can speak to what extent developmentally dreams are studied. But, you know, we know they dream, but we know they actually don't know that they dream, right? Because they would wake up and enact their dreams and talk about them. But when you know, challenge them, they say, oh, no, that wasn't a dream. That was actually really happening, right? So there's definitely maturing meta-awareness, which is not quite there until around age 5 or 6. You know, when we do these tests for school preparedness, they really actually test for meta-awareness. And meta-awareness doesn't quite begin to form until around then. It depends on the area. It depends, like, if people are really highly experienced, including kids in something, they could appear to have it because of how skilled they are in certain subdomains of life. But meta-awareness about novel material basically matures around age 5 or 6. And there's some variability around that, right? So in terms of this variability of thoughts, if you understand mind wandering in terms of variability of thought, there's actually, I think, a peak of variability in childhood, right? And interestingly, I think it correlates, there's a really close connection in my mind between the variability of mental process, which I understand in terms of mind wandering, and the concept of play. Because it really is a way in which our minds play, right? When they start getting variable and go fanciful and generate all kinds of things that are kind of whimsical and in some ways nonsensical, that is a form of play really that the mind does. And it's actually very easy to shut down. Or you have to tell yourself that that's silly and you should just get on and do something productive, right? And society is very good about planting these attitudes in our head. And so I think, you know, kids, as they grow up, if you understand mind wandering in terms of variability, there's actually developmentally a peak that they go through, which is very adaptive, just like play is adaptive, because just like physical play has to do with activation that leads to the wiring up of connections into the even something like the training up of muscles. I think in the same way that this mental place and this mental imagination that they get into, that I think in some ways school then really suppresses, right? You know, when they start like 4 or 5, you know, if you just listen to a kid, they will tell you these amazing stories that they just come up with them. And I think that is a part of it's beneficial for them, because it's a way in which they experiment with concepts, they experiment with experiences. If you listen to them, they're not very good at telling stories, right? So if you listen to them, well, what happened today? Nothing. And then they go on to invent an amazing story, which is not necessarily what happened, but it takes elements from you know, things that they experienced during the day. So you can actually think of it, it's almost like they're in a dream state, in a waking dream state at that age of like around 4 or 5. And I really think that there's a peak that they go through that, which if we didn't kill it through the educational system, might actually go on for longer and might do even bigger things than it does right now. But of course, then they go to school and they start learning that this is not the best thing to do with your time. And then in terms of autism, autism is a really interesting thing, because and we haven't actually specifically talked about that, but one of the connections that we never explicitly drew in the literature or in our writing yet has to do with this sensory stream of experience, right? Because one of the phenomena that happens in autism is that kids with autism can be extremely sensitive to the sensory environment. And so one interesting thing to consider is, you know, do they have in some way, are they really so sensitive to the variability in the environment that then they need to get protected from that through various strategies that ends up making them appear as though they're inflexible, but actually they're really much more sensitive to the variability. And because of that sensitivity, they need to build so much bigger constraints and automatic constraints in the environment. So they need routines and they need, you know, their familiarity in order to cope with the onslaught of this variability that they actually have a increased capacity to perceive. So there's some potential to using these ideas of automatic constraints and variability to understand autism, but it's not something we've looked at directly. And if anyone has any ideas, I'd love to discuss.
That's great. I think although we have some more questions, but we also have other things to do. So maybe we'll wrap up the seminar at this point. Big thank you for you, Kalina. Great presentation, and also wild speculation, very stimulating thoughts. And thank you, audience, for just watching until the end. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks again for the invitation. And thank you for the excellent questions as well. I really enjoyed them.
Great.
Later.